Welcome back to the last panel of the day, which is my pleasure to moderate and to chair. And we have two papers. The first paper is by Markus Schmid, and it's called As California Goes, So Goes the Nation, ? Board Gender Quotas and the Legislation of Non-Economic Values. And you will be since this is the Global Corporate Governance Colloquium, we have not invited somebody from California to discuss this, but we will have Becker, who is going to discuss this from Stockholm and provide us with a Swedish perspective on what they're up to in California. So, Markus, the floor is yours, and you have 20 minutes.
Okay, so thank you very much. I hope you can see my slides. First, let me thank the organizers for including our paper in the program. The paper that I'm going to present is joint work with Felix von Meyering, also at St.Gallen, Alexander Nissen-Rinzi at Mannheim, and Stephen David Solomon at UC Berkeley. Now, as you mentioned in this paper, we analyzed the board gender quota that was introduced in the state of California in fall 2018. And most importantly, we put forward a new explanation for this negative announcement return that was to be observed around the adoption of this quota. Now, our paper is clearly not the first one on board gender quotas in general. It's also not the only one on the California quota. So let me briefly say a few words on prior literature on board gender quotas to then set the stage for our paper to motivate our contribution. Now, clearly the most well-known paper on board gender quotas in general is the one by Ahern and Dittmar published in the QJE, and they analyzed the Norwegian quota, which was introduced in 2003, which was actually the first quota worldwide. And they basically have two main findings. One is that the adoption of this quota was associated with large negative stock price reactions. And the second result was that in response to this quota's adoption, the boards became younger. The newly appointed female directors had less experience than incumbent directors. And this all led them to the conclusion that the pool of female candidates was not large enough to absorb this demand shock that was happening around the quota's adoption. And for that reason, the board quality decreased. And also in response, of course, then firm value declined. And this is what we refer to henceforth as the friction-based explanation of this negative market reaction to the quota's adoption. There were a number, and I think there still are a number of papers that are written on the Norwegian quota, and many of them find similar results. There's also conflicting evidence, and here certainly the most well-known paper is the one by Ekbo and Coulters that is now forthcoming in management science, and they do some adjustments to the methodology. Most importantly, they account for cross-sectional correlation in the test due to this one event study. And what they find is that when they do that, the negative market reaction becomes statistically insignificant. And they also do not find any evidence that board quality declined around this quota's adoption, leading them to the conclusion that the pool of female director candidates was actually large enough to absorb the quota and that actually nothing happened. Now, as I mentioned, there are also papers on the California quota. There are two contemporaneous studies to ours. One is the paper by Green and Coulters that is now published in the JCF, and there's a paper by Wang and Coulters that's still a working paper. And both papers, as we do, find robust evidence, also accounting for Ekbo's and so on's criticism of the Ahern Dittmar paper, very robust negative market reactions to the firms that are headquartered in California and are affected by the adoption of this board gender quota. Then they do similar tests to those in Ahern Dittmar, and they also find evidence in support of this friction-based explanation for the negative market reaction. Then there's a very recent paper by Gertzberg and Coulters that also looks at the California quota. And they also find a negative market reaction to California headquartered companies affected by the quota. But they then do also propose, as we do, a new explanation for this negative market reaction, which is a different one than this friction-based story of Ahern Dittmar, Green et al. And Wang et al. And what they show is that the negative market reaction is not driven by the appointment of female directors of lower quality, but that it's actually driven by the fact that the wrong male directors are let go to add female directors to the board. So basically the more valuable ones are let go. Now, the difference between that paper and ours is that their study is restricted to the California headquartered firms directly affected by the quota. We also, of course, look at them, but we mostly focus on the spillover effect to non-California headquartered firms and propose another explanation for this negative market reaction to those firms and also to the California headquartered companies. So what is our study about? What do we do in our paper? First, as I mentioned before, we find very robust evidence of a negative market reaction to this quota's adoption of California headquartered companies that are affected by the quota. We also find, and this is probably more interesting, very large spillover effects to firms that are headquartered outside of California, so they are not directly affected by the quota, and in particular to firms that are headquartered in states that have a high propensity to follow California's legislative direction, for instance, because they did so in the past, because they also have a very high regulatory density, and so on. We'll see that later on in the paper. Now, we show that frictions can explain part of the negative market reaction of California headquartered companies, but they cannot explain any of those spillover effects that we find. And we also show that there's another mechanism that contributes to explaining California headquartered companies' negative market reaction. So what we do is we propose an alternative channel, which is that the adoption of the quota signals the government's willingness to add future regulatory interventions that target at non-economic values that basically shift the corporate landscape from a more shareholder-centered to a more stakeholder-oriented view. And in summary, we basically find that this negative market reaction to the adoption of the California board gender quota is not really about the appointment of female directors, but it's mostly about the anticipation of future regulatory interventions that affect corporate decision-making, and they ask companies basically to follow or to pursue non-monetary goals. Now, our explanation and our empirical findings are consistent with anecdotal evidence, and provide one example here. And these are some quotes of a speech that SEC Commissioner Hester Pierce gave at the 17th annual SEC conference. And here you can see that she said that this California bill, the board gender quota in California, is one piece of a broader set of new rules that somehow relate to ESG. And then she argued that this increase in stakeholder orientation is going to reduce firm value, and that decisions like that are going to introduce uncertainty and political influence into corporate decision-making, and that this is going to have a negative effect on company values in the future, and that this is not going to stay in California. As we know, nothing that happens in California stays in California, and as you'll see later on, this is very consistent with our empirical evidence in the paper. Now, let me first say a few words on the California gender quota, which was introduced by the name California Senate Bill 826. It was signed into law by then Governor Brown on September 30, 2018, and it was the first board gender quota that was introduced in the United States. And also, as of today, it's the only one that has that is mandatory and has a clearly defined penalty. It applies to all firms that are listed at the major stock exchange and headquartered in the state of California. And it requires those firms to have at least one female director as of year-end 2019, and then depending on board size to have 1, 2, or 3 by year-end 2021, so at the end of this year. Now, the effectiveness of the law is still debated as of today, and there are mostly two reasons. One is that the statute is non-criminal, and the penalty is relatively weak. It's a $300,000 fine per violation, and the violation is one missing female director. So the maximum fine that is to be paid by companies is $900,000. If you have 6 directors or more, and you have no single female director on the board, then you have to pay 3 times this fine of $300,000. Now, this is relatively weak. It's of course relatively small in monetary terms for large public corporations, Secondly, of course, if you compare this to other penalties, for instance, in Norway, where the penalty is a forced liquidation of the company by the government, this is not a very harsh penalty here in California. The second reason is that the law may be declared unconstitutional for two reasons. On the one hand, it may violate the corporate internal affairs doctrine because it governs matters of the corporate board at the level of the state of headquarters instead of the state of incorporation, as it usually is the case. And secondly, it may violate the Equal Protection Clause of the US Constitution. And the reason is that it actually only asks for a minimum number of female, but not male directors. So it's basically discriminating against men. This is also a difference to the Norwegian or other continental European quotas that we have. And both of those may actually result in this bill being declared unconstitutional. This means that, of course, on purely legal grounds, you may this law not to be very effective, not to be very relevant. Still, of course, the law may be perceived to be binding by many or even all companies because public pressure may force them to comply and reputational concerns. And actually looking at the end of 2019, only about 15 companies out of 500-600 were not in compliance with the quotas requirements. So most firms still comply so far. But it's going to be interesting to look at what happens at the year end 2021. Here's some information on our sample. We have a cross-section of CompiStat firms that have a reporting date within 1 calendar year before the quotas adoption, so in September 2018. We then drop firms in regulated industries, and we also drop firms for which key information is not available from CompiStat, CRISP, Bordex, and the databases that we use. This results in a sample of about 2,500 firms. 458 are headquartered in the state of California. So they're affected by the quota, and roughly 2,000 are headquartered outside of the state of California, but within the United States, and they may potentially form our control group. Now, in our baseline settings, we use an industry and size match control group of 780 firms. In robustness tests, we use other control groups. For instance, if you use the entire set of 1,996 firms, we find similar results, even a bit stronger results. Now, here's the first set of results. The dependent variable in those regressions here is the cumulative annual return over, in the first column here, over 2 days. This is Monday, Tuesday, after the law was signed by the governor on a Sunday. What you can see here is that the dummy variable on this California headquartered dummy is negative and statistically significant, indicating that California headquartered firms reacted by 0.7% more negatively than the other firms in our control group. Now, probably more interesting is the constant down here. And we can see that the constant is also negative and statistically significant. It's quite large, it's 1.9%. So we can see here that the firms in the control group reacted by minus 1.9% over 2 days to the adoption of the quota in California, even though they were not directly affected by the quota. And California headquartered firms reacted overall by minus 2.6%, so more negative, but still a very large effect in the control group. Now, of course, we then checked for confounding events. We also checked for other laws that were signed on the same date. We also checked for direct connections between the California firms and the control group firms, for instance, by looking at key clients, as reported in CompiStat, by excluding firms in close by states and so on. We didn't find anything. And also the other papers looking into that did not find any other confounding event. So the question is, of course, what drives those large spillover effects to non-California headquartered firms that are actually not directly affected by the quota. And now, as I said before, our alternative explanation is that those firms react to this signal of the state's willingness to influence corporate decision-making and force companies to follow non-monetary goals. Now, to do that, we first define a firm-level measure of the sensitivity to legislation. And for that, we use the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index of Becker and co-authors that is widely used by now. This is basically the scaled number of newspaper articles that include a word that relates to uncertainty, a word that relates to economy, and a word that relates to political decision-making like Congress, legislation, regulation, and so on, aiming to pick up articles that comment on political uncertainty, how this affects then how political processes affect economic uncertainty. We then follow a procedure used by previous papers and estimate a market model in our estimation window that is augmented by the daily change in the EPU index. And we classify firms as policy sensitive if they have a significant exposure to this daily change in EPU index. And this applies to about 11% of our sample firms. About 37% of those firms are headquartered in the state of California. Now, to show you that this was a meaningful event having influence on the investors' uncertainty regarding economic policies, we plot here the distribution of changes in daily EPU. And as you can see here, our quota, the adoption of the California board gender quota, is a quite significant event here. Only 4.4 of those 250 days in the estimation window were associated with a larger increase in economic policy uncertainty. So that was quite a meaningful effect, and it actually affects the perceived political uncertainty. Now, does it then explain some of our announcement returns? And as you can see here, we have the same specification, we have the same dependent variable as before, but now we interact our California headquarters dummy variable with a dummy variable for policy sensitive firms, and also then in as of column 2 here with a dummy variable for or with a measure actually of frictions in the direct labor market. So we have 8 of them, including all of them used in the other papers on the California quota. Here for space reasons, I only show 2. One is the shortfall, that's the number of missing female directors for quota compliance, scaled by board size, and then we have just the number of missing female directors, and we have 6 others. Now, what you can see here is that California headquartered companies that are also policy sensitive react significantly more negatively to the quotas adoption. You can see that also in column 1 here, this directly absorbs the negative coefficient on the California headquartered army that we observed before. Now, in column 2 and 3, and in the other 6 columns that I do not show here for space reasons, we can see that frictions also contribute to that. So the more females have to be appointed, so the more the company is subject to those potential frictions in the direct labor market, the more negative the announcement return is going to be. So both of those explanations, the policy uncertainty and those frictions in the direct labor market, contribute to explaining this California headquartered dummy variables effect. So California headquartered firms affected by the quota react more negatively if they're policy sensitive and if they have to appoint more female directors. Now, next we focus on the spillover sample. And the reason is, of course, that if fear of impending regulation drives this spillover effect to the control sample, then non-California headquartered firms that are located in states that have a high propensity to follow California should have a more negative reaction, of course, to the quotas adoption. And you have 8 different measures as proxy for the propensity that the state follows California. One is whether the state also discussed the gender quota at the time that California introduced the quota. Then you have measures related to how strict the environmental policy of the state is, California, of course, being a leader there. And then you have 2 measures, whether the state historically followed California's legislative direction by introducing minimum wages in excess of federal levels, by legalizing cannabis. And then we have 2 regulatory scores provided by think tanks, where California ranks highest in both, so they have the highest regulatory density. And then other states that also have a high regulatory density may have a higher propensity to follow California's legislative lead. And finally, we have the votes for the Democratic Party in the last presidential election before the adoption of the quota, which was Trump's election in 2016. And the reason, of course, is that Democrats and Republicans in general have a very different stance on non-economic laws that pertain to a stakeholder orientation. Now, what you can see here in this table is that all those coefficients are negative and all but one are statistically significant at the 5% level or better, suggesting that firms in the spillover group, in the control group that are located in states that have a high propensity to follow California react significantly more negatively. This is, of course, consistent with our explanation, but it does not rule out the alternative friction-based story of Green et al. And Wang et al., because, of course, this could also be based here on an anticipation of an introduction of a board gender quota in those other states. And this is the final set of tests I'd like to show. here where we try to decompose this negative announcement return to the spillover to the control sample into a part that is the result of impending legislation of non-economic values, and one part that results from an anticipation of a board gender quota, and is for that reason then related to those frictions on the director labor markets. What you do here is it's the same set of tests as we had on the previous slide, but now we interact those proxy variables for the propensity that the state follows California, which are listed here, with the policy sensitivity dummy variable and with the different measures for frictions. Here in this table, I show the shortfall variable. The other 7 measures are reported in the online appendix to the paper. Now, what you can see here is that the interaction between the propensity to follow California and the policy sensitivity dummy variable is always negative and statistically significant, suggesting, of course, that those policy sensitive firms react significantly more negatively when they are located, and the firms are located in a state that has a high propensity to follow California and also to follow their legislative process. On the other hand, we do not find that the shortfall variable and all the other measures we have for those frictions and the director labor market contribute to those spillover effects. This leads me to the conclusion. We find robust evidence for frictions in the director labor market that this explains part of the California effect, as other papers do, but they do not explain any of the effects in the control sample to non-California headquartered firms. We propose that this effect mostly comes from the anticipation of other laws that move closer to a stakeholder-oriented view, and that shareholders do not appreciate this type of lawmaking. In summary, we find that this negative stock market reaction to the quotas adoption is in largest parts not the result of the appointment of female directors. And this, of course, tells us that even cost-neutral policies may have negative stock market effects if they are perceived to shift towards a more stakeholder-oriented society, if you want. And those expectations, of course, may be purely rational, and they are not anyhow related to a gender bias of any type. Thank you. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very much, Markus. Bo, I think we can go straight to you.
I would provide a Swedish perspective. I guess these are my esteemed neighbors in Norway, who are the pioneers in this area. I think the picture is from some kind of event a few years ago that they had in the EU. Norway is not a member, but we try to follow their example in the European Union, including in this. And this is when they were talking about that. Okay, so that's the context. I guess that Norway was a pioneer, and the issue is, are we providing a good system for boards and more generally for women in business, in executive roles? In many countries have been working on it. You don't need to take any particular figure away from this or pattern away from this graphic. It's just showing that a lot of countries are working on this. And so the European Institute for Gender Equality, reported in The Economist magazine, says that in the last 10 years, there's actually been quite a lot of more women on boards, perhaps reflecting these quotas. And this paper, which is about the California law, shows that indeed this was followed also by a rapid increase, statistically significant, but small in the first year of the number of female board members. So I guess it's working. Now, one question you want to ask, I think, taking a step back from this literature, is what's the impact beyond the boards themselves? And so I like this paper by Bertrand et al. I think maybe I took the picture from popularized version of the paper. The point is, they look at the pay of Norwegian women and men with MBA degrees, and they were separate. They were quite distant before the reform in Norway, and they remained so afterward. For this is 5-6 years after. You can think about issues with this measurement, but I guess it's right at least to zoom out and think about the sort of general equilibrium impact on women's careers in business. What about executives? So it's not just pay, it's also promotions. So I downloaded some data from the European Commission. They count executives by gender. I don't actually know what they mean by executive, but I think it's something good. And these are all the countries, and you can tell they're all over the place, but you can also see that the average, which is this purple dotted line, the EU 27 average, has been rising steadily from a low base 10 years ago, like 10 to something like 20 now. And Norway's above and also rising. So there's movement here. Okay, so what about quotas as a means to increase board representation and ultimately enhance women's careers in business? I think you can ask whether it's good for affected companies, which is the main focus of this paper and several others. That has many sub-questions to it. Is gender diversity, female participation, is that good for the companies, say their value? You could ask whether it's good on average, on some margin. Such a margin might be increased by some law, and is that beneficial? And there are many other dimensions of diversity, and so you could be interested in asking how those, should we legislate other dimensions? If this was good, maybe more. I think the main question is if it's good for society, and more specifically for women in business. That, to me, that seems like that was the purpose. And so if I want to give the Norwegian politicians this thumbs up, it has to be because that thing was better. So that's what I really want to know. Now, I'm not saying that this paper is asking the wrong question. I'm just saying the other question is the more important one. Anyway, if we can have whatever we like, then we want the answers to both for sure. So we're looking for those better career outcomes, maybe better incentives early in the career for women who now for the first time realize that they might be rewarded by the top jobs, and so on. And then the more efficient allocation of talent in society. Okay. So now on to this paper. I think this was highlighted fairly clearly in the presentation. Here's the key finding. California firms lost 0.7% of their market value, their equity market value. California headquartered, no, incorporated California firms. I'm a little hazy now, actually. I should probably know that. Anyway, they lost 0.7% of their value compared to the other firms. All right, so this constant here is something not quite, but related to the average return for non-California firms. It's not quite that because you have these other controls here, but kind of. Okay, you can think of it as this is the mean return for the day for non-California firms, and then California firms dropped another 0.7% on top of that. That's the finding. Okay, so one interpretation here that's put forward by the authors, and maybe I misunderstood it, I don't quite buy it. It's something like this: libertarian shareholders are sending a signal that they don't like government intervention. I have many questions about how this would work. Okay, is it unrelated to future share performance? How are they deciding to sell shares that when there's no, if they don't have any expectation this is going to impact dividends or profits or performance? Is it completely unrelated to share characteristics? If so, how do they coordinate about what shares to sell? Why were the other states affected? Isn't it best to just send the signal with California firms? Or did they also have libertarian shareholders who were upset? Okay, I'm trying to be a little bit funny. It seems like a stretch to me. Let me say, okay, GameStop and Dogecoin also seem like a stretch to me. So maybe I don't understand how financial markets work. I would be surprised. Okay. Just a hunch, not an actual criticism. Let's talk about, I have one concern here, one issue, I guess, as a real discussant, which is about statistical precision. Okay, so event studies have been around for a while, and they're pretty cool because there's so much data from the stock market all the time. What we're looking for, ideally, if we can choose, is an event that happens randomly to firms at different dates. That gives us good statistical power. You know, every day you pick one firm and then you do that for 500 days. After that, you're going to know what the average impact is of this event. The question that this paper faces, and the other studies that use event study methodology to think about things like gender quotas or other law changes that have a broad impact, is what do you do if you have a single date? And usually the answer is you have some treated firms and you have some non-treated firms and you compare them. In this case, we're comparing California to non-California. Okay, so you hope that all the other news that arrived to the market that day have the same impact on the treated and the non-treated. Right? Many things happen. Every day the stock market goes up and down, obviously. So we're just, for many reasons, news, but maybe it's not even news. It's just somebody's, you know, Reddit post. Whatever it is, we hope that it's hitting the treated and the untreated the same way. So that leads us to the question of California. Are they different? And so what you're worried about is that they co-move, so that those, it's not actually all those firms, right? It's firms, it's really just one California firm. They all have the same stock price. They all go up and down together. That's co-movement, and then we don't have as much precision as we thought. But this could be because they have high betas, for example. So they're all moving with the market, but more. So it looks like they have a bad day, but just the market has a bad day and they are more affected by it. But I think the more serious concern is that they're idiosyncratically correlated. Like there's stuff beyond market movements that are, you know, tend to hit the average California firm the same way. Could be political, macroeconomic risks, weather risks. I don't know how familiar everybody is with the US, but my understanding is that California is pretty special. So this seems like an important concern. They have a different industry structure. All those evil corporations that Professor Admati was talking about, they live in California. Well, maybe not all of them. Okay, just to highlight how different California is from many other places in the US, this is election outcomes from 2020. That's a good summary statistic of many demographic variables. So California is this blue blip on the border, on the edge. Here's another thing. This is from a completely different sphere. This is from the U.S. Geological Survey. The chance of slight or greater damaging earthquake shaking in 100 years. And it is above 74% in their opinion, exactly in California and basically nowhere else. I don't think that's super important for daily stock returns, but it highlights the general concern. Let me give you one more, slightly more serious attempt to talk about it. I sorted Compustat firms based on their headquarters states. I threw out everybody with less than 200 billion on market cap. And I list them here by the industry mix of that market cap. So California is the biggest state in terms of market cap. And here, this is the industry split. This black thing here is IT. That's pretty big in California. Healthcare is the second largest. That's a red pick. If you look at the other big states, they're actually quite different. For example, New York and Texas are the second and third largest. And Texas is dominated by this purple thing, that's oil. And New York has a lot of consumer non-durables and finance. So you could see how if it's a good day for oil, then Texas has a good day. If it's a bad day for Facebook and those guys, yeah, then California has one of those days. So we're a little bit concerned here, I think. So let me just to really hammer home this point, let me talk about error matrices, or these are the variance covariance matrices for errors in a return regression of daily stock returns. This is regular linear squares. You assume that two observations are correlated. That means they both have a variance of their error term, which is sigma. It's the same for everybody. And then it's the covariances are 0. So every observation is its own little data point, and it doesn't really depend on anything else. So every time you get one, it's more information. Now, if you have heteroscedasticity robust standard errors, you allow these variances to be different. It doesn't really help us with this California concern, right? Even the CAPM says that's not quite true for stock returns because they all move with the market. Okay, so you cannot use heteroscedasticity. That's not right, okay? Now, it would work better if you use excess return. So use a market pricing model, like the CAPM, you take the residuals and then you make some assumption. But even so, I still think we're gonna have something like this, which is that all the California firms are gonna be correlated with some correlation rho, maybe 0 with everybody else, but they're still gonna be, you know, together, moving together. The same thing is going to be true for Texas and then for New York and so on. Okay, so how do you solve this? You have a parametric or a non-parametric approach. You can estimate kind of empirically what is the covariance matrix like. Well, Greenwood did this in 2005. He's probably not the inventor of this, but it's a nice write-up. You can do a non-parametric approach, which is to say, what is the daily return on California versus non-California firms? And what's the history of that number? Just give me 100 or 1,000 of those, which the authors do to their credit, excellently implemented. And so here's that 1.9 intercept. How rare is that? It's not super rare. Anyway, see, it's kind of in the middle of the tail. I don't think that's super important anyway, because that's just the aggregate movement. And on this day, there was some news of Brett Kavanaugh, and there were many things happening that day. There was a trade deal. There were news about Canada, US trade. It's bizarrely was an issue of economic risk back then. So this is the one we're interested in. This is the difference between California and the rest. It was over here. That is 0.7% from 0. On average, it's 0 because the average return is the same. How rare is that? You can actually count the days here. They didn't do it for that long a time window. So these little bars here are 1 day. Those constitute 2.4% of observations. So with the 5% limit, you know, that's significant, not super, but somewhat. But in fact, I think you have to look over here too, because they're running a two-sided test, because they would have written the paper if the return was significantly positively different from 0 as well. So you need to count there, and I try to count. So it's 2.4 actually there too. So it's actually 5%. So it's not super significant. The result is basically weak. Now, I may be doing it wrong, and maybe you should count, you know, do a bigger sample here, and you could do the parametric thing. Okay, so I just don't think it's super significant. So then the spillover on others, I think that's super interesting what happens in other states, but the weak first order result means it's going to be super hard to really nail down spillovers, I think. Think about, you know, what covariance is going to do to that. So for example, Illinois, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, and Washington added quotas later, and they're used in some regression. But if you go back to my maps, you know, they have the same blue color that California does. Maybe they have the same industry structure. So there are all kinds of concerns, but I think it's an interesting question. So that was all. I wanted to endorse that. And I just wanted to point to this paper by Gertzberg, Möllerström, and Pagel, which was mentioned. I think that's pretty cool. They look at the support for female and male directors. And they point out that female directors tend to have higher support. And they say you can interpret that as evidence that the bar is higher for women directors, which I think is interesting and comes back to this business of how is this working for women, which I think is what we also want to ask. All right. So I think we face a fundamental problem. Nobody's done anything wrong here. I don't think it's super convincing econometrically. There's just not enough data provided by these, you know, single events. Maybe we have to use multiple reforms to kind of conclude things and not have one paper per reform, but eventually somebody should put all of them, all the legal changes into a single econometric framework across stock markets, which I think is an interesting but doable challenge. Okay, and then to repeat myself, I guess I think the biggest question is women, not firms. My prior is one reason I think like this is my prior is that the effect on firm value has to be pretty close to zero. Anything really huge would be super weird to kind of think about how a board member could really destroy or create massive value, given how much selection is going into it. So it just seems weird to me if it would be big. The other one, I don't know. The social value could be quite large. That's the legal case. I'm not saying I'm just saying it's, some people make that claim and it's not impossible. This could have a huge long-term benefit for women early in their careers. Maybe that's just my view. Anyway, okay, so let me end with this picture of the glass ceiling, which is what this is about. And thank you very much to the organizers for having me discuss. And thank you to the authors for a very interesting paper.
Thank you, Bo. So Markus, do you want to just respond? And then I already have 2 questions here from the chat, and there's nothing in the Q&A at the moment, but if you want to also go in the Q&A, and then people can also raise their hand. And if nobody has any questions, I have plenty of questions. So Markus, please.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to quickly respond. Thank you very much, Bo, for your excellent discussion and the points you raised. Now, of course, some of the things are hard to say right now because you don't have that long time window as you have in Norway, for instance. So is it good for women or not in the long term? Do things change for women? We can't say yet, right? We don't have that much time. Actually, quota compliance is only going to be terminated by the end of this year. This basically pertains to a number of comments that you raised. So we're interested in looking into that, but we cannot do that yet. Then the statistical precision that you mentioned, of course, that's an issue, and this applies to all those papers on board gender quotas that are one event studies, right? Which is also the cross-sectional correlation problem. Now we address this by doing a number of tests, the one that you showed, but also, of course, by doing the portfolio sorts analysis that accounts for cross-sectional correlation problems. This is the main criticism of the ECPO paper, or by ECPO of the Ahern-Dittmar paper, by looking at other laws and whether and how they influence that and other confounding events. You mentioned some. We did some tests. Also, the authors, Green et al., Wang et al., did a number of tests that tried to tease out whether any of those alternative things that went on affect results. We didn't do all of those tests that the authors already did. Some of them are quite time-consuming, and there's actually so far no evidence that any of those other things drive the adoption, the quota effect that you observe. And then, of course, the industry structure is different in California, right? We also have a large number of firms. We have roughly 20% in our sample are California headquartered. Some of them are focused in other industries. They're also some of the largest firms are in California. That's why we, for instance, use as a in our main test the industry and size match to have firms in the same industry. Now, arguably, we could use other industry definitions, narrower ones, which brings it away further in terms of industry. But we did a large number of tests, and so far all of them basically show quite similar results. So far we don't find results to be anyhow affected by those different control groups that we apply. But again, of course, more could be done there. What is also, of course, reassuring to a certain extent of this result is that all the papers, the Gertzberg et al. Paper, now the most recent one, Green et al. And Wang et al., we all have somewhat similar, somewhat different settings. We all have somewhat different samples. We basically use different databases to a certain extent, and we do different robustness tests, and we all find basically across all our tests a similar economic magnitude and very robust findings. It's a very good idea, of course, to look at other legal changes as well. This would bring us away a bit from this one event study. We attempted to find others, but many of them are hard to use. On the one hand, many of them were not surprising enough, so there's no clearly defined event window or event date There's also a paper by Daniel Ferreira, for instance, on Norway, criticizing the setting that we have too many confining things. We have no natural control group. We have a staged adoption of the law, basically 5 possible event dates and so on. And this applies to many of the alternative laws we looked at that were introduced in California. We focus on California laws. Then many also have the problem that we cannot really measure basically the firm's compliance and the gap to compliance, because, for instance, the emission standards or the emissions are not consistently reported across firms. So for that reason, we don't really know where firms are right now. And this is, of course, one of the major appeals of the quota law, where you can easily count the directors. We can observe the gender of the directors, and we can basically easily have or come up with measures of that. But it's a very good idea, and I think it's worthwhile to think about and further looking for other laws that should give similar results, because of course our story is not confined to a board gender quota. And basically, maybe the very last comment, you mentioned that you consider it unlikely that directors, the appointment of some directors has that large effect as we and the others observe. And actually, we absolutely agree, right? So that's our story. It's not about the appointment of those directors. It's basically about further signals about a different regulatory direction that is taken by California and some of the other states. It's important to mention, of course, this is the average effect in the control group. This is restricted to a set of states, of firms headquartered in some states. It does not apply to all of them. Arkansas and others that are completely different from California, they did not react on average. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much again for your comments, and I'd be happy to receive your slides, of course.
Great, thank you, Markus. So I have a queue already of 3 people. I have Jeff Gordon.
So I find myself a little puzzled by the analytic setup of the paper. The argument appears to be that the spillover arises not from the negative shareholder wealth effects of the gender quotas, that is to say the frictions, but from the anticipation of other laws, social value laws that would have negative effects. Well, but if that's so, I don't see why that wouldn't, in a sense, meet Beau's point fully. So it might be that the effect in California has nothing to do with the makeup of boards, but rather because of a certain barrier having been breached. Who knows what comes next? One, for California. And then secondly, insofar as you're looking at spillover states, I don't see why the same point wouldn't apply. That is to say, if the California law increased value, then a spillover state that would be great. The stock price ought to go up. If the spillover, if the law decreased value, then the spillover effect is because they're worried about the imitation of a law that decreases value. So there's a certain, either you think the law increases value or not for reasons A or B, but then I don't see how you get a sort of a diagonal, as it were, to the spillover states.
So Markus, let me maybe add to Jeff's question. I think your title, as California goes, so goes the nation, in some sense suggests that California is a leading indicator of some federal law that might come in. But you haven't really presented, as far as I could tell, any evidence for that. Is that something we observe? And what's your answer to Jeff's question on this?
Well, we do observe, right, that other states follow California. So we, in our spillover test, we have 2 examples, which is the minimum wages that where California was the first state to go above federal levels, and then many other states followed suit. Also, the legalization of cannabis, for instance. California was also always among the pioneers in stricter environmental laws, for instance, the greenhouse gas emission laws, or in the formation of the US Climate Alliance that was then introduced after President Trump resigned from the Paris Agreement, for instance. It was one of the 3 founding states, right? And then many other states joined. So there is ample evidence that California was the first or among the first states to adopt regulation of this types. This is basically then what you show there, right? That the California gender quota was also the first board gender quota that was introduced. And as of today, as far as I know, it's still the only one that is introduced that has penalties and is mandatory. Many of them that were prepared at the time did not go through. For instance, New Jersey was one that was then voted down or was not signed. Others were basically softened up and became basically comply or explain type of quotas. So it's as of now, I think it's the only one that is really binding and has clearly defined penalties. So California often was a pioneer and was the first state. This is basically one law, right? And I absolutely agree that we could, in principle, look at others. Difficulty is, as I mentioned before, to find others that have a clear event date, right? We need to have a measurable day, a date in which this law was implemented. Before that, there has to be a significant uncertainty so that we can measure that. We cannot use 6 months or 12 months as event when there is way too much noise or a too low signal to noise ratio. And also many of the other, the measures are hard to measure, right? There's no standardized reporting of any type of those emissions across firms. So we don't really know where firms are, which firms would be affected by the law, which firms already would be in compliance. That's basically the difficulty. So that's where we struggle to identify more laws. But of course, we're happy to learn about other laws, and we also started to look into finding other laws that we can use, which would actually then, as Jeff Gordon said, should trigger similar findings, right? So the finding we have now is that the effect in California at the adoption of the quota was negative, and in states that have a high propensity to follow California's legislative direction, which could be here as we look at also by discussing a gender quota about doing other things historically or to have similar regulatory density, is they also react negatively on average. Other states that so far are not very similar to California, they are the states on average, the firms on average that are headquartered, they did not react. As this is confined to similar states, and the result is quite robust, and of course the measures are quite different, right? Discussing a gender quota was only 5 states, others are roughly half of the United States, but of course many of the states sort, you know where they are, right, on the 2 coasts, mostly sort in the same bins, basically, the California high propensity to follow California bins. So this is basically the story, right? And I agree also with the second part. Of course, the California law serves as a signal to others that they may follow suit. And we argue, however, that the evidence does not really support that it's about this lack of females on the boards and the need to change the board, because in all those other states in the spillover group, the effect does not vary anyhow across firms, whether they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 female directors on the board. It's totally unrelated to that. They do not react in response to that. This, of course, suggests that it's not really about them having now to adjust to a female board gender quota, but to have to adjust to other laws that may actually follow this one, which may be introduced. And also looking at California by itself, we find some evidence that firms that need more female directors are affected more negatively. But again, this only explains basically a fraction of the effect. That's not all that goes on, even in California. So there's a large part unexplained of the California dummy variable.
Okay, so I would probe you a bit more, but I think we have Callie and Todd. So Callie, you go first.
Well, I just had a thought in listening to the presentations as to whether, thinking beyond state level legislation, whether looking at NASDAQ as a market institution and its initiatives, how that might fit into the analysis.
So basically argue that we could look at NASDAQ initiatives and how they affect firms that are listed at NASDAQ, obviously, right? That's the firms that are directly affected. And then also look at
whether it's a demonstration, the NASDAQ initiatives, whether they are a demonstration of a spillover effect. And given that it's not state level legislation, but a market institution taking an initiative, whether that is a spillover effect and whether it might play out differently.
So spillover to firms that are not listed at NASDAQ, but at other, at Amex and NYC and so on, basically would be your suggestion, right?
Whether California's initiative was linked to NASDAQ's initiative.
Okay, no, okay, yeah, we didn't look into that. We could look into that, yeah.
So I agree with Bo that, a better understanding of what's different about California firms and why they might be responding differently to the news of that day is a first order concern. But beyond that, it seemed like a lot of your arguments kind of hinge on this measure of how sensitive a firm is to policy in those interaction terms. And I thought it might be useful if you also kind of provide us some statistics of what's different about these companies that are more policy sensitive versus those that are not, so that we could get a sense of, might there be other reasons why these companies are responding differently to the news of the day or differently to the fear of a gender quota that aren't really about concerns about future government intervention?
Yeah, that's a fair point. We can look into that. What we did before, which is somehow related to that, was we had another measure, which was the firm's ESG score, which also may serve as a measure of how well those firms are prepared for this more stakeholder-oriented view that may be introduced by the California laws and the laws that other states introduce. And we also found similar results, so that firms that had high ESG scores were affected less in California and abroad, and those that had lower scores were affected more. What we didn't do yet so far is really to look at how the policy sensitive firms, which are about 11% in the sample, differ from the others, and whether this gives us some insights in what or whether this could relate to the laws. That's a good point. Yeah, so you can compare those two. We look at different subgroups, right, depending on whether they have females on the board or not, and so on, but not across different policy sensitivity exposures, if you want. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we can take one more question. Does anybody?
I think there's some in the chat here. There's, for instance, one whether the constitutional challenge brought against the California gender quota would be another event we could exploit. In principle, yes, right. Of course, if there would be a treatment reversal, that would be very good for us and for the others looking into that quota. So we'll see what's going to happen there. Absolutely, that would be very interesting to look at.